Yeah? Okay. Okay, good evening, everybody. You say with your mouth full of hummus. Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Christina Heatherton, along with my co-organizers Jordan T. Camp and Manu Kuruka. We are delighted to invite you tonight for a book talk with Professor Paul Ortiz. Let me just say a few things because I'm about to introduce a dedicated man. How dedicated is he, you ask? Well, he is so dedicated that earlier today, Paul Ortiz gave a talk at Barnard College where Jordan, Manu, and I teach together. And he was staying in Washington Square Park, and he rode a bike all the way from there to 120th Street. That is dedication. And then, dedication on top of dedication, he rode that bike back in the headwinds. So Paul Ortiz is a dedicated man. Again, how dedicated is he? Paul Ortiz is so dedicated, he has made you all a handout with key terms from his book so you can follow along and listen and learn as he talks. Jordan, I think, will help me pass these out. This is after the talk. So I want to say tonight that Manu, Jordan, and I mean, we couldn't be more excited to be here in the People's Forum, which is such a special place. I want to thank everybody here who made tonight's event possible, particularly Leanne, Nelio, Vincent, David, Kimberly, Manolo, the cleaning staff, the cooking staff, everybody who does the invisible work to make this place just run like a dream. Thank you so much. We also want to thank the Center for the Study of Social Difference at Columbia University and New Directions in American Studies that are co-sponsors of this event. And finally, I want to say also that tonight in having this public event, Jordan, Manu, and I are standing in solidarity with the students at Barnard College and Columbia University who are protesting a racist incident that happened on that campus last week. For those of you who don't know, a black student named Alexander McNabb, who's a student at Columbia University, was stopped in the Barnard College library last Thursday. Because public safety didn't believe that he had a right to be there, he was surrounded by 5 officers, manhandled and pinned on the counter of a coffee bar. And even after he showed his ID, the officers refused to believe that he belonged there, and they continued to harass him. I've been in touch with Alexander, and he has asked me to do the following. This is what he says, quote, "Please continue to spread the word about what happened and make that word translate into tangible, sustainable, and significant structural changes in the way in which public safety operates on both Barnard and Columbia's campuses." So I share that so that we can support him in the way that he has requested. I want to say that we also come here tonight understanding that this incident of undeniable racism, this racist attack, was not an isolated event. It is a reflection of the school's contentious relationship to the surrounding Harlem community. Alexander McNabb was presumed not to be a student there, and we should be clear that some version of that encounter happens between public safety and the local residents around the campus every day in both overt and subtle ways. And this is especially because Columbia University's growth and expansion has led to widespread displacement and the gentrification of people in Harlem for decades. These dynamics have only furthered segregation locally, both in terms of who is able to live there, as well as who is able to learn there. So I also want to pass on a message from an organized group of parents in the neighboring Public School District 3, which is both the most diverse and the most segregated school district. And they have asked us not to isolate this incident. They have asked us to link it to a broader problem of segregation more generally. As I often say, if you show me the boundary between a school and the local community around it, I will tell you what the students there are being taught about themselves and themselves in the world. So our task, our challenge as educators, is to figure out how to learn, to think, to act, to study under these conditions and to challenge them. And I could imagine no one better than Paul Ortiz to guide us through. How dedicated is this man? Well, when he came to Barnard's campus after riding the bike, it's a long bike ride. The first thing that he did, and looking great, the first thing that he did is he brought a message of solidarity from the Dream Defenders in Florida. Paul Ortiz is a student advisor for the Dream Defenders, and he said to those students at Barnard College, "We stand with you and we will give you whatever support you need." This man is the real deal. So let me introduce him. Paul is the director of the award-winning Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and is an associate professor of history at the University of Florida. He was the president of the Oral History Association from 2014 to 2015, and he is the author of a number of wonderful books, including an African American and Latinx history of the United States, which he will be talking about today. He is also the author of a number of other books, and I'm going to read their full title because I think you should know what this man is writing about. One of my favorite, and the way I was first introduced to Paul Ortiz, is through his book Emancipation Betrayed, and the subtitle is The Hidden Histories of Black Organizing and White Violence in Florida from Reconstruction to the Bloody Election of 1920, which I encourage you all to read. Paul is also the co-editor of Remembering Jim Crow, African Americans Tell About Life in the Jim Crow South. He has published essays in a wide array of publications, including Latino Studies, the Oral History Review, Radical History Review, Truth Out, Against the Current, the list goes on. I'm going to stop there. He also writes very frequently for the popular press, so if you haven't encountered his work in scholarly venues, you might have encountered it in the media. Paul is the first vice president of the United Faculty of Florida University's Florida Union chapter, and as I said, he's the faculty advisor for the University of Florida's chapter of the Dream Defenders, Students for a Democratic Society, the Venezuelan Students Association, and as he told us today, a number of other student associations. He was awarded the 2013 Cesar Chavez Action and Commitment Award by the Florida Educational Association, AFL-CIO. I mean, aren't you ready to hear this man speak? I'm amped, and I already know him. Okay, so please help me in welcoming Paul Ortiz.
Now I don't really have to say anything, do I? I can just kind of sit down. I mean, Christina, like, dropped the mic on us. Well, thank you, first of all. It's so wonderful being here, this amazing space, the People's Forum. And I just want to just congratulate and thank all of the organizers that have made this space and have kept it going. And in Gainesville, Florida, where I live, we have the Civic Media Center, and it's a wonderful institution in our community. It's a place that people come together and meet, the IWW, Dream Defenders, Indivisible, NAACP. I mean, a whole range of groups meet at the Civic Media Center, but we have nothing like this. I mean, this is just incredible. So let's give the organizers another round of applause. Tonight I want to talk about an African American and Latinx history of the United States and talk to you about where the book came from and what it tries to do in terms of radical history. And the book really comes out of three different locations or sources, if you will. One is my personal experiences growing up working class, Chicano in the United States. I didn't know the U.S. was a middle class society until my first graduate seminar at Duke University, when my peers were going around the table talking about, you know, the U.S. is a middle class society. And I never heard this before. It was a revelation. I grew up in a shipyard town, Bremerton, Washington, and my father worked as a power plant operator for 35 years, has a lung full of asbestos. All of his shop floor workers had passed by the time my father was in his mid-60s. They all had passed away because of illness, industrial, or accidents. In fact, I remember as a young boy growing up in Bremerton, not only did we have one of those big signs outside the shipyard gates that said, you know, this is 5 days without an accident, but we also had one that said this is so many days without a fatal accident. That was just the environment that we grew up in. Another really origin of this book is it comes out of the classroom, you know, teaching. And I've taught a course called African American and Latino Histories now for a little over about 20 years. The handout you have is, on one side, of course, it's the chapter outline. And that outline is really rooted in my experiences in working with students like myself, a lot of them first-generation college students. And you can imagine in teaching in Florida, or when I taught at Santa Cruz, and working with first-gen students from Mexico or from Haiti or from Cuba, and trying to tell them that one of the major themes in U.S. history is the U.S. is an isolationist country. And my students just fall out. You know, they think it's the funniest thing they've ever heard in their lives, or some kind of weird thing, like isolationist. Like, the U.S. was messing with Haiti from even before we became a nation. You know, half of the slave plantations in Cuba were owned by U.S. Americans, right, in the mid-19th century. So this notion of isolationism and many others that I learned in college just didn't make any sense back then when I was in college, but my students really helped me clarify my thinking around these events like slavery, like Reconstruction, like the struggle against imperialism. And then the third route, which is equally important to the first two, is, you know, the amazing scholarship and organizing and activism that this book is based upon. And it's based upon reading people like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and then becoming her colleague. And I was telling people last night at the NYU lecture I gave that one of the cool things about kind of hanging out with Roxanne, and then I've been intersecting with her a lot on this book tour, because in the time I wrote this one book, Roxanne has written like 3. You know, so she's always out, but I'll usually miss her by a week or 2 or 3 days, you know. And during Q&A, often someone will get up and say, are you Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's brother? I'm like, yes, I am. You know, it's so cool to be associated with her. You know, the work of Angela Davis, the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, the work of Rudy Acuna, who's just working actually, I think, the 9th or 10th edition of Occupied America, A History of Chicanos in the United States, such an important book. But people like Ernesto Galarza, a great Chicano scholar and labor organizer, working in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And so that's really the third foundation. And I couldn't have written this book without, you know, those 3 kind of sources kind of coming together. So what is in the book? And I have to remember not to point back there, but point up here. So we're going to go on a history roller coaster for about 30 minutes, if you're okay with that. Is everyone okay with like a history roller coaster, like back and forth? Okay. So the book runs from about the 1770s to present. And what I was given in terms of the task was just do a reinterpretation of U.S. history and do it so people will read it. It's interesting, and we need you to introduce new characters to us, not just the same tired, wore-out, old white men, you know, like Alexander Hamilton, blah, blah, blah. You know, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. I mean, when I grew up, when you talked about the Revolution in my family, and we talked about the Revolution a lot, believe me, because the Revolution deeply impacted us, and it actually had a psychic, moral, mental, ideological impact on my family. But it wasn't the American Revolution. It was the Mexican Revolution. And for millions of people like myself, when you talk about the Revolution, you're talking not again about the American Revolution. You might be talking about, we were talking earlier about my student, Armin Fardis up in Harvard. For him, it's the Iranian Revolution. I mean, here's a young man whose parents were members of the Iranian Communist Party in the 1970s. Or it could be the revolution in the DR in 1964, 1965. Or it could be revolutions in Africa or Asia. But those revolutions, I mean, the idea behind this book is to try to understand that the U.S. is just as much about these other revolutions and what people in other countries have taught people in this country. We talked earlier today at Barnard about the incredible progressive character of the Mexican Constitution from the very beginning of our nation. Even before Mexico was a nation, Mexico had a more progressive constitution than people in the U.S. ever dreamed of. I mean, first of all, it abolished slavery. It talked about the abolition of torture. It talked about freeing indigenous people from caste oppression. And it didn't completely achieve all these goals, right? The very few constitutions do. But it set these amazing ideals and ideas into motion. And I'll talk about a few of those as we progress. I understand that the class, some of you as students read Chapter 1 in the Haitian Revolution. And it's not like I'm saying the American Revolution doesn't matter, but the Haitian Revolution is really the central revolution in the Americas. It makes the Latin American independence struggles possible. All of those great leaders that we celebrate in Central America and Latin America, most of them ended up in Haiti at some point, learning how to fight and win a revolutionary war. The Haitians taught them, and they said, you know, basically, we've defeated the French, we defeated the British, we've defeated the Spanish. So, you know, take some notes, Simon Bolivar, right? Take some notes, Antonio Maceo, take some notes, Jose Marti, and the list goes on and on and on. And again, it's not like I'm saying the American Revolution isn't important, it's very important. But the Haitian Revolution is what sets, and if you look at the early slave revolts in the United States, what becomes the United States, almost every one of them key on Haiti at some point. Here's one, 1811, a great revolt in north of New Orleans. The plan that enslaved African Americans created was to essentially burn down the plantations north of the city, march on New Orleans, take it over, declare New Orleans to be the first free city in the entire North American continent. That's what it would have been, the first free city. And then immediately apply to Haiti for diplomatic relations and military reinforcements. And if that plan would have succeeded, U.S. history would be much different, my friends, much different. But another amazing moment, which I'll talk about too, is that happens around 1814, 1815, is people who are organizing in the Mexican War of Independence against the Spanish, fighting a desperate struggle for independence. The Spanish still have one of the finest armies in the world, incredible artillery, very accurate, very deadly to go up against them. Jose Maria Morelos, who had been a priest up until 1810, when the War of Independence breaks out, writes to James Madison, President of the United States of America. And he says, you know, y'all just fought a revolution against the Europeans. And the British actually came back to North America and burned y'all's capital to the ground. You know, it's really odd when you read about the War of 1812 in the U.S. history textbooks and they say it was a victory. I'm sorry, I grew up in a military family, I'm a veteran. If you come into my country and you burn down my capital, you lost. Or like we lost, I guess you could say, right? So Morelos is saying, and he wrote these letters, incredibly eloquent in Spanish, and people ask me, what was the funnest part of the research? And this is one of the funnest parts, was to read these letters, to try to understand where Jose Maria Morelos, one of the world's greatest revolutionaries who's ever lived, where he's coming from, what he's trying to get across to James Madison, right, who we see in this country as this incredible democratic philosopher. But then when you understand the exchange, you realize that Morelos is the much greater philosopher of democracy, that it's Morelos who understands the trajectory of U.S.-Mexican relations. And it's Morelos, not Madison, who offers a key to building this incredible relationship between Mexico and the U.S. And what Morelos says is, if only we could form an alliance between Mexico and the United States in 1815, we could keep the grasping Europeans, that's the term used, the grasping Europeans, from coming back and trying to steal from us. Because you know they're coming back, that's just who they are, right? If you know anything about U.S. history, you know the outcome of that. It represents this incredible moment of possibility, but James Madison is not interested in that. He's interested in perpetuating what? Slavery, imperial war, because to grow slavery, you have to fight wars. And if you look at the early chapters, chapter 1, chapter 2, 3, and 4, the most important political dynamic in the United States of America between the 1790s and the outbreak of the U.S. Civil War is that out of all the nations in the Americas, the United States is almost the only one that's trying to grow slavery as an institution, while at the same time surrounded by nations trying to abolish slavery or who have already abolished slavery, like Mexico. And my students have given me some great metaphors to work with. When I've talked about this, they've said, you know, this history sounds like a lot like Star Wars, like The Empire Strikes Back. You know, like you have the Death Star, and you have these rebels fighting, like the Seminoles and the Creeks, and you know, then you even have the French and the British, who, even though they're an empire, they're moving towards abolition. But then you have the Death Star, and you have Darth Vader, and they played with, I think they even had Hamilton as Darth Vader one time, because I shared a letter that Hamilton had written to the Continental Congress, and he was infuriated that the British, or he was infuriated that almost 5,000 African Americans evacuated to freedom at the end of the American Revolution with the British. And Hamilton was beside himself. This is our property. They've stole our property. And yet, today, I've heard, I haven't seen it, but I've heard he's on a Broadway play doing hip hop, right? But that's interesting. That's very interesting. I haven't seen it, so I guess I'm not allowed to talk about it. So I won't talk about it. So I promised a history roller coaster, so here it is. So I was talking about the colonial period, early revolution. A fun thing about this book is you get to chapter 8, and I get to talk about things that I actually participated in or watched people do, or did oral histories with some of the organizers. And I argue in chapter 8 that the general strike of 2006 represents a possibility that's still unfolding, a potential for power, for radical change. A lot of the students that I work with who were organizers in the general strike in places like LA or the central coast of California or Seattle used those experiences and went from there to become labor lawyers, you know, teachers, rural healthcare workers, and some of them, I'll introduce you to a couple tonight, who actually now are kind of working their way up the ranks of the new labor movement. But one of the things I want to point out to you about the new labor movement is who's leading the new labor movement. You're looking right there. Those are the leaders of the new labor movement. This is not your grandfather's labor movement. This is not George Meany or Lane Kirkland or, you know, those old guys, you know, God rest them, right? Walter Reuther, wonderful people. But this is a very different movement. And the picture on the right, I just wanted to point out, is a direct action that student organizers took in Santa Cruz. In that photograph, they're shutting down one of the great highways in this country, Pacific Coast Highway 1. They have completely shut it down in solidarity with the union workers who asked them to help them in the struggle and collective bargaining. One of the amazing things when I taught at UC Santa Cruz was that the first generation Latino workers are incredibly organized. You know, they're in the Service Workers Union, they're at the AFSCME, American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees Union. They don't need students or faculty to be advocates for them. They have their own working class organizations. So when we would work with them and when they had me come out and give a speech, they would just use me as a token professor. I didn't have to be a leader. I didn't have to tell them what to do. I mean, they knew what to do because, again, they controlled their own organizations. In this particular case, they asked the students, because you are citizens of this country, you can take a chance, you know, if you make the choice to engage in direct action. We can't be arrested because a lot of us are undocumented. So we would like you to engage in this action. And they did, and was very effective. I mentioned in the beginning that the book tries to refocus U.S. history, place the Black freedom struggle in Latin America at the centerpiece, but argue that U.S. history is a working class history. It's not a middle class history. That, to me, is so ridiculous. I could give you a lot of examples, but in the book, I talk about Dr. King, and one of the things that Martin Luther King was trying to teach us in the years before he was assassinated was that the U.S. is, if you want to characterize it as any kind of economic system, it's a history of poor people. That's what the Poor People's Campaign was about. And Dr. King would often say, because people would say, well, isn't the U.S. a middle-class nation? He would say, no. And he wrote this down. He wanted to make sure that people understood it. So it's actually in Chaos or Community. You can read this. Dr. King said that the well-meaning liberal who tells us that the U.S. is a middle-class nation makes a fundamental error, because most people in this country, in the history of this country, have been poor people. And when you change the narrative to say it's a middle-class nation, you're stigmatizing working class and poor people. And you're making it appear as if you're not wealthy, then there's something wrong with you, right? And so, flashback to my first week at Duke University seminar, where I have rich peers. I mean, these are folks whose great-great-grandparents went to Harvard or Princeton or Columbia, and they're saying they're middle class. I'm like, no, you're not. Y'all are rich, you know. And they're saying, you know, if they decide that grad school doesn't work out, they're going to work in their father's law firm or, you know, in their parents' shipping company. I'm like, y'all are not middle class. But so it's important to recenter U.S. history. That's what the book really tries to do. And, oh, I forgot to talk about. So when Dr. King was assassinated, one of the first compelling interpretations of his life is given by the United Farm Workers, what becomes the United Farm Worker Union. You know, union of working class, Filipino, Chicano, African American, white working class people. And notice how they frame the meaning of Dr. King's life and his death. They don't deny his eloquence, and this is a special issue of this journal. And normally it's just focused on farm worker issues, but they realize the tragedy, the scope and scale, the world historical nature of this person. And they say that he was killed helping workers to organize. And by this time, the UFW had already lost people to police violence, to grower violence. And the framing of Dr. King's life and death, I would argue, is an important metaphor for reframing U.S. history. Because, of course, he's not the only person, right, who dies in this way. On the right, of course, Dolores Huerta, the co-founder of United Farm Workers Union. And then we come forward in the roller coaster. So last slide was 1968, 2 weeks after Dr. King was assassinated. And now this is in the 2000s, and again, I get to kind of brag about this because two of my former students worked in this union campaign in Smithfield. And one of the stories they told me is in the book, and I'll just give you a very succinct version of it. So the story is that this organizing campaign involved mainly Latino and African American packing house workers, or food processing workers, I should say, for Smithfield, one of the world's great food processing corporations. And the Latino immigrant workers approached the management a few weeks before Martin Luther King Day and said, we want to commemorate Martin Luther King Day. We don't want to just take the day off and go hang out. We actually want to have formal commemorations, you know, and formal observance of Dr. King's life. The Anglo management responds by saying, y'all don't know who Dr. King was. You're from Central America or Mexico or, you know, wherever you all are from. Just keep working hard. But you don't know who Dr. King was. And the response was telling. It was, we know more about Dr. King than you all do. We understand what he lived for and what he died for. And that's what we want to commemorate. And they went out on strike. They actually went out on strike to win the right to commemorate MLK Day. And I would argue that this is part of this incredible momentum, working class momentum, that is breaking out all across the United States, but it's kind of under the radar. Kind of like the general strike of 2006. If you read today in the business press about that strike, you will read that it was just kind of a one-day rally where people hung out and marched, blew off steam. If you research carefully, entire corporations had to shut, Cargill Foods had to shut down, Tyson Foods had to shut down, South Florida agriculture paralyzed, trucking on the west coast of the United States paralyzed because Mexican truckers refused to deliver any goods or commodities. And it was so effective, in fact, it really brought terror to the hearts of the American ruling class. But they have been working overtime since that time to get us to forget this incredible accomplishment, so much so that when I give organizing talks, I'll often start by saying, because I'm also a labor historian, I'll start by saying, what is the greatest general strike in American history? And you mentioned earlier SDS, and I work with International Socialists, the DSA, the IWW, a lot of wonderful organizations. And my first day of my labor history class, I'll ask that question: what was the greatest general strike in U.S. history? And my students are so proud to share knowledge with me. And I'll talk about Seattle, 1919, Oakland, 1946, the Haymarket, right? And other great movements. I'll say those are all great general strikes. Those are great movements. We need to know and honor those. But the greatest one is one that you all may have been involved in. You may have marched in as a student, May 1st, 2006. And even people who participated, like myself, forget sometimes, right? Because that's what the system does to us. We organize these incredible things, and then we're encouraged to forget them and to defer to power. One of my dissertation advisors, Larry Goodwin, called it sophisticated deference. We're almost ashamed or embarrassed of our accomplishments. But we need to remember that strike because, again, I think there's incredible effects that are still unfolding. Haiti is the key to liberty in the Americas. And again, our authorities have tried to get us to forget this. They've tried to stigmatize Haiti. It's one of the most effective and vindictive propaganda campaigns in the history of this hemisphere, not just in this hemisphere, but Europe. Brothers and sisters, I've been to France. I've worked with educators, teachers, who were shocked to discover that the first emancipation, the first abolition in France wasn't in the 1830s. It was in the middle of the French Revolution. That fact is not even taught, or was not even taught, in a lot of French schools leading up to the bicentennial of the French Revolution. They didn't even know it. Teachers didn't know it. And they were ashamed and embarrassed. And I said, don't be ashamed and embarrassed, because people in the U.S. don't even know basic elements of the American Revolution, right? People in Mexico, many, and I've worked with a lot of first-gen students from Mexico, didn't know that Mexico had abolished slavery before the United States. They had been brainwashed into thinking, oh, the U.S. is ahead of everything. The U.S. must have taught everyone else how to be free, right? Thus, really leading us to a lot of problems. So I'm going to play an excerpt from the book instead of reading it. Beacon Press, which published the book, I'm so grateful, they actually did an audiobook. The reader is J.D. Jackson. He's a theater professor and an actor. You'll recognize his voice. And I want to set the stage for you. So this is the closing weeks of World War II. All the nations of the Americas gather together, except for Argentina. And they're trying to figure out, how are we going to stop the next World War from breaking out? Because we've had two terrible conflagrations that have almost destroyed the planet. So how can we rebuild in such a way that we're not going to have World War III? And this is on everyone's mind. This is before this conference is pursuant to the United Nations Conference of Bretton Woods. But it doesn't take place in San Francisco. It takes place in Mexico City, Chapultepec, very historic suburb of Mexico City. And the United States comes with its ideas. Mexico has their ideas. All the nations have their ideas. But it's the Haitians that hold the key to the whole thing. So let me, if I have this queued up properly.
Emancipatory Internationalism versus the American Century, 1945 to 1960s. The writer Carl Hansberry traveled to Mexico in the winter of 1945 for the Pittsburgh Courier to cover the Inter-American Conference on Problems of War and Peace, convened at Chapultepec, a historic suburb of Mexico City. Delegates from 20 independent nations of North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean met to forge further cooperative measures for the prosecution of the war to complete victory. The Chapultepec Conference, as it would come to be known, was tasked with creating a plan furthering the maintenance of peace and collective security in the hemisphere after the end of World War II. Participants were also charged with discussing the consideration of methods to develop such cooperation for the improvement of economic and social conditions of the peoples of the Americas, with a view to raising their standard of living. The Mexican muralist Diego Rivera sketched scenes from the conference's daily proceedings with a plan to create a series of murals on the subject of fostering hemispheric unity. The United States delegation steered the assembly to focus on security and trade matters. However, nations such as Nicaragua, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic understood from decades of hard experience what the United States meant by security. As if to confirm their suspicions, Senator Tom Connally of Texas, chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, claimed that the Assembly was creating a new Monroe Doctrine, backed by all the Americas instead of just the United States. Connally asserted that this new Monroe Doctrine would be based on the president's war powers to order U.S. armed forces anywhere they may be needed to promote the United Nations war effort. Haiti dropped a bombshell on U.S. plans to dominate the conference. The Haitian delegates submitted a resolution that said the security of the hemisphere hinged on the equality of nations, as well as the equality of people in those nations. This resolution stunned the delegates, and it was not covered in any mainstream media outlet in the United States. Carl Hansberry excitedly shared the exact language of the Haitian resolution in full with his Pittsburgh Courier readers. It read, "Whereas the practice of racial discrimination is not only contrary to the positive reports and conclusions of scientists, but is also in formal contradiction of the Christian doctrine on which our civilization is based. Whereas the Nazi doctrines that submerged humanity into the most terrible catastrophe of all time came for the most part from the Nazis' pernicious and pretended notions of the inequality of races. Whereas world peace cannot be established except on the valid idea that all men, regardless of their race, nationality, or religion, be accepted with full equality. Therefore, the Conference on Problems of War and Peace resolves to recommend to the governments of the American republics the complete abolition of all political regulations or actions which make possible discriminations against people based upon race, religion, or nationality." Haiti had once again struck a blow for liberty. Delegates built on Haiti's bold intervention to craft a more democratic vision of post-war possibilities.
Sounds pretty cool, huh? Except for the fact the next day, the Mexican delegation comes to the table and they say, you know, we really appreciate this, but you all left out women. Where's women's equality in this? It isn't there. Haven't you read our Constitution? Okay? So this treaty, this document eventually is ratified. The U.S. is a signatory, a very ambivalent signatory to it. And immediately, people like Dennis Chavez, people like Polly Murray, people like Thurgood Marshall seize upon the Treaty of Chapultepec and use it to argue that the United States can no longer discriminate, use laws to discriminate. But how do you think the United States responds to the Haitian resolution? Being that we're the freedom-loving nation, right? We're the most advanced democratic nation on the planet. How do you think the U.S. responds? They're terrified. And we all should know Hansberry, this writer, had a famous daughter who was, right. Carl Hansberry is writing from Mexico, and he writes, he calls editors of Washington Post, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, all the great newspapers, the U.S., the white newspapers. And he says, why are you all covering this? What the Haitians have introduced, what the Mexicans have introduced. because they wanted to cover it from they wanted the new Monroe Doctrine. Okay, just like John Bolton was in Miami this past week talking about what? The new Monroe Doctrine. Okay, this is kind of a trope in U.S. history. But the reason I brought up this kind of sequence is to let you know that my argument here is that we can no longer tell U.S. history from the vantage point of being in the U.S. You got to break out of that kind of mental prison. You either have to physically leave the country, or you have to use your historian's imagination. And if you're a great teacher, you can do this, right? You have to be able to kind of imagine yourself, what does the U.S. look like to people in Mexico or Haiti in 1945? So when the U.S. comes to the table saying the peace and security of the hemisphere depends on the power of the U.S. president to deploy troops at any moment, how does that look to someone in Mexico or someone in Chile or other countries? So that's a big theme of this book is, you know, we can complain about nationalism. And in this country, about every 20, 25 years, you have this ugly resurgence of nationalism. Let's be honest, white nationalism, right? And it manifests itself in some very negative ways. But as long as we write history from the vantage point of this country, from the vantage point of the elites, then that's what we're going to get, is nationalism, because that's all we have provided our students and ourselves with, the same tired role models, generation after generation. Oh, we're betraying the ideals of our founding fathers. No, we're not. The founding fathers in this room right now, okay, I've read all of the Madison's writings. I've read Jefferson's writings. We had Stott and Lynn, the magnificent dissertation, Class Conflict in the American Revolution. 90% of the people in this room, I'm sorry to tell you, the founding fathers had no love for you or us. No love whatsoever. And never conceived of loving us. And the correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and people writing him about the 1791 Naturalization Act, which is the foundation of immigration law to this day, although it's been superseded, is the proof of the pudding. And I found letters that very wealthy, powerful people were writing to Thomas Jefferson during the debate over the 1791 Naturalization Act. This act which would decide who could become a citizen, how long it would take them, on what basis would they be welcomed into the polity. And what these guys, and they were all guys, were saying to Thomas Jefferson is, we appreciate your support for this naturalization accord, because we have to understand, we plan to move across this whole continent and take the whole thing over, right? We're going to roll with maximum force. But we have to understand two things. One is we're going to need black labor to do this, to move across, because for whatever reason, Europeans didn't want to do that work. And number two, we're going to be surrounded by Native Americans. And so we had better create a naturalization process that excludes those groups from easy access to citizenship. And that's why I say the founding, so the whole notion of we're betraying the founding fathers' ideals, I don't use that phrase anymore, because those ideals don't include me. They don't include my people and where we came from. No disrespect. Christina mentioned I advised the Venezuelan Student Association. One of the fun things about teaching Latinx history is to talk about, again, the central nature of Haiti to the Latin American independence wars. I talked about the role of the Mexican War of Independence. This is the original Constitution, which people talk about in 1813 in Mexican historiography. It's not framed yet as a document. People talk about the barefoot army of slaves and Africans carried this in their hearts. In other words, it wasn't written down. It was something that they took into battle with them. And when you move forward, this is kind of a highlight of the letter, and the idea of emancipatory internationalism is really something I learned again from reading Rudy Acuna, Angela Davis, Betita Martinez, Cedric Robinson. especially Cedric Robinson's idea of the black radical tradition. You know, this idea of an African freedom ideology which long predates European colonization into the Americas. And what I was trying to come up with was an idea that basically says that if I'm free and my neighbor is unfree, I'm not really free at all. And how this manifests itself later on is, I'll kind of skip ahead here, in the beginning of chapter 4, Reconstruction. The first sentence essentially says something like, African Americans decided that emancipation in one country was not enough. And radical black abolitionists, people in this frame, it was easy in 1860, I won't say easy, it was understandable in 1865 that if you've been an anti-slavery freedom fighter your whole life, you probably at some point were physically brutalized. You had been beaten, you had been attacked, you had been fired, you may have been driven out of the country. And so it's very understandable that someone like William Lloyd Garrison would say, you know, the Civil War is over, it's time to dismantle the anti-slavery societies. You know, we fought the good fight, and, you know, now it's time to kind of, you know, we need a rest, right? And again, we don't want to cast aspersions on those folks, but Henry Highland Garnett and Douglass and the people in this frame and many and hundreds of other radical black abolitionists are saying, what would it say about us as a people if we dismantle our anti-slavery organizations and just kind of pick them and go home? Number one, we would be betraying our brothers and sisters in Cuba, in Brazil, in Russia. Remember, Russia has just abolished serfdom. And we don't even really know if slavery has ended in the United States, y'all. Okay, it's in theory, but there's nothing other than a piece of paper, right? And so what African Americans do in the middle of this titanic struggle to defend themselves against the Ku Klux Klan, to establish the right to vote, to try to acquire some land, is they form one of the largest mass movements in U.S. history. And it's a national movement. It reaches into every large, small, medium-sized black community that I've ever studied. Even Santa Cruz, California, has a chapter of the Cuban Anti-Slavery Society. And they're pushing the Grant administration to recognize the Cuban resistance to the Spanish. Now, in the book, I talk about the learning curve. And initially coming out of the Civil War, some African-American leaders say, well, maybe we should go and bring some regiments to help the Cuban freedom fighters fight the Spanish. And then they kind of, and they're like, well, no, not a good idea to ask the U.S. to go help free someone. So what we need to do is create diplomatic space so that they can be recognized and that they can be resupplied and refitted by any nation that will work with them against the Spanish. That's what I mean by emancipatory internationalism. And it grows, it thrives. It's a major theme in U.S. history, and it's exactly why W.E.B. Du Bois called the defeat of Reconstruction the worst tragedy in the history of the modern world. Not just the history of the United States, not just the history of the Americas, but the worst tragedy in the history of the modern world. And the core of the tragedy is that African Americans lose political power and the right to vote just at the moment when their vision has the power to possibly transform and change the entire nation and move the U.S. away from imperialism. And I learned this from reading those brilliant last 2 or 3 chapters of Black Reconstruction, because those chapters from Du Bois's Black Reconstruction are not just about what's happening in the U.S., but they're talking about the international dynamics of Reconstruction and what it meant to lose that battle. The South gains political power over the entire nation, and the U.S. becomes decisively an imperial nation. Let me go back to Douglass's point, racial capitalism, another idea from Cedric Robinson. So if you read Black Marxism, you know this idea very well from Professor Robinson's great work. Frederick Douglass is telling us why the Civil War happened. And if you know anything about Frederick Douglass, if you really knew Douglass, you would never invite him to come and speak before you, like you've invited me. And the reason you wouldn't is that Douglass didn't go by a script. And so if you asked Frederick Douglass to come and speak about what does the 4th of July mean to the Negro, he'd mess up your house. So on this particular occasion, a group of well-meaning we'll call them Northern liberals, asked Frederick Douglass to come and talk about the importance of the Union cause and the terrible Confederacy and how wicked they are and how noble our cause is. And instead, Frederick Douglass comes and messes up their house. And I'm not going to read the quote, but basically he's saying, y'all brought it on yourselves. You brought it on us. You can't fight imperial wars all over the Americas and not have the chickens coming home to roost. You can't fight 3 separate wars against the Seminole people in Florida. You can't fight these wars against the Creeks. You can't invade Mexico and then expect that everything's going to turn out rosy and that I'm going to stand in front of you and say, y'all are the good guys. He said, no, it doesn't work like that. He said, we are paying the price for your mistakes, like right now. And so it's a really powerful reminder that these critiques, this is not a critique of a successful constitution, by the way. This is a critique of a failed constitution that 1 million people will have to spend their lives on trying to kind of set right and then create the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. We could argue about the efficacy of those amendments, right? But let me fast forward because I need to move to closing. This is an example in the book, Reverend Lena Mason, one of the many people who we need to rediscover. Sounds condescending. She doesn't need to be rediscovered. She just needs to be heard. Lena Mason was one of the great religious Christian evangelists of her time. And she spent a significant amount of time teaching Americans that people in Cuba don't need your help. They need your solidarity. They're actually doing pretty good job fighting the Spanish. And here she wants to lift up to our attention the role of Cuban women in the struggle. I can't tell you everything about that. If I tell you everything about that, then you won't buy the book. So we'll skip ahead. But no, this is another aspect of this is I've done a lot of talks in high schools, in teachers' workshops for high schools, but also with high school children. And the thing that teachers and administrators are asking for in the really good school districts is new approaches to history, new approaches to social studies. Can you make history interesting? We're tired of history being the boring subject. Why does it have to be boring? Could you introduce some characters that our students could identify with, that they could see? Can you also introduce a curriculum where our students could talk to their elders, their parents, their grandparents, oral histories? You know, in other words, learning that we have amazing stories and experiences to bring to the United States or to the classroom. It isn't about assimilation, it's how we've struggled to change this nation from the very outset. So Lena Mason is one of those people. The Culinary Workers Union is composed of women who are heroes and waged one of the longest strikes in U.S. history. And as a young labor organizer, I would come across every once in a while people, organizers for the Frontier Strike in Vegas. And these are hope to God trade unionists. And they would tell us, and I remember I was working with the UFW at that time, and they would say, before we went out on strike, the first thing we did was we just moved out of our apartments. We knew that the casino owners would get to our landlords. And so we didn't want to give them the pride of ejecting us from our apartments. We just moved out. And some of them lived in tent cities in transitional housing. And again, they helped change the course of this nation's history. And I'll just go into the service aspect of that. Barack Obama gave his speech on immigration in 2013, not in D.C., not in Miami, but to the Culinary Workers Union, because that was the union that got him elected. That last chapter talks about how the Culinary Workers Union, a union of 64,000 workers from 84 nations across the world, was one of the first large labor organizations to endorse Senator Obama. The moment they endorsed him, within hours, the LA Federation of Labor, 1.5 million members, the Bay Area Federation of Labor, big unions, it was almost like the domino effect. It was really incredible. And I want us to remember the working class center of this nation's history. And that was something that Senator Obama knew and that he very much benefited from. Again, this new face of the labor movement, the possibilities, the Fight for 15 movement. We mentioned earlier the Dream Defenders. A lot of movements have been generated out of the organizing experiences that organizers learned during the general strike. My wife and I spent December in Mexico City, remembering and learning and seeing in person, up close, these incredible murals. It's one thing to see an image of a Rivera mural in a book, but to actually be up close is just incredible. To remember the painful, brutal history of European colonization in this country and how it has impacted us as peoples, the traumas that it's inflicted. And this is an aspect of our histories that we have to really deal with and try to kind of comprehend. Elizabeth Catlett. I mentioned, and I'm wrapping up, an important part of this book comes out of the classroom. And so it's just so amazing to be able to work with students and introduce them to people like Elizabeth Catlett or Langston Hughes, Arturo Schomburg, and to talk about the intersectional natures of their experiences. Intersectionality doesn't just start in like 2016, right? I mean, Langston Hughes writes one of the greatest poems in American history on his way into Mexico to meet with his father to do something that all of us who've been college students can understand. He's asking for money to go to college, right? But his father has given up in the United States. His father says, any Negro who still is a business person in the U.S. is insane. We have a lot more opportunities in Mexico. And he proves it. He's this very successful business person. Now I'm going to kind of fast forward here. This is the system my father and my elders grew up with. The signs, the degradation. Imagine trying to be a parent. And it's always hard to be a parent, right? But imagine the signs are constantly everywhere reminding you you're inferior. Your children are inferior. And then having to be a parent to try to protect your child's morale and sense of dignity, right, and sense of integrity. Stetson Kennedy, this was a photograph on the cover of Jim Crow Guide. It's a book about segregation in the United States, published in 1956. Stetson Kennedy couldn't publish this book in the United States because the U.S. is the freest country on earth, right? That's a joke. He had to go to France to get this book published. Guess who his line editor was? Simone de Beauvoir. And so, again, fast forward. The other tier of this book, again, to understand U.S. history, you have to leave the country. And so for me, the first time I left the country was I was in U.S. Special Forces. I was deployed to Latin America in the mid-'80s and introduced really quickly to a lot of different people I never knew about, like Augusto Sandino was one of them. I thought he was still alive because his image was everywhere. The phrases, the graffiti were everywhere. Every country I was in, Augusto Sandino was there. And so again, the idea, having to leave the country and learning U.S. history for the first time from other people's perspectives. And one of the questions people would ask us, whether it was Panama, Colombia, Honduras, or Venezuela, or wherever I was, why are you here? What do you think you're doing? I grew up in a gun culture. I taught pistol techniques. I taught radio operations. My father had been recruited to take part in the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he passed down certain communication skills to me. War was all we knew. But now here I was, 20 years old, sergeant in Special Forces, having people ask me, what is it you think you're doing? And not really being able to come up with a good answer. But it took many, many years to process those experiences. And I'll conclude with Augusto Sandino, because I ran into him many years later in the archive. And this time I ran into him through African-American perspectives. And I'd read about Sandino in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Chicago Tribune. I'd read State Department papers about him. They characterized Sandino as a criminal, as a bandit, as a murderer, because he had the gall to oppose the U.S. invasion of his country. But when you read black newspapers, they had a very different depiction of him. He's a freedom fighter. He's just like George, and they would say things like, if you're familiar with the history of George Washington, Augusto Sandino is like a contemporary George Washington. And these are not so-called radical newspapers. The Norfolk Journal and Guide is not edited by a socialist radical, okay? But when they talk about the U.S. victories over not just Sandino, but other Central American, Latin American freedom fighters, this is what they say. These are not victories to be proud of. These are victories to be ashamed of. And these are perspectives that I'm really trying to get across in the book. And the very last slide I'll show you is very meaningful to me because Francisco P. Ramirez is one of these individuals that, thanks to digital technology now, we have a lot of the really important Mexican and Spanish language newspapers in California especially are online. They're accessible. And you can learn about people like him, and you can learn about this Mexican abolitionist tradition in ways that I couldn't when I was in college. The cool thing about this mural, it's actually painted by high school students. So they're learning. The momentum, and I mentioned this earlier in my talk, the momentum for ethnic studies now is really in the high schools. On the right-hand side is Frederick Douglass. And this is a very personal story because my wife Sheila and I ended up lost in West Belfast, and we walked into a shopkeeper's shop, and we said, we're looking for the Bobby Sands mural. And in Northern Ireland, that was like a key, magic key unlocking a door. And people took us in this working class community, this shipyard community, kind of like the one I grew up in, to see these murals. And if you've never seen these murals, it's kind of like if you're familiar with like East Los Angeles, we have these great murals, but they're constantly under siege. Like I heard someone told me at Caltrans, California Transit, just painted over one of Judy Baca's great murals. A tragedy. But this mural is one of the permanent murals on West Falls Road. And if you look carefully, you'll see above it is barbed wire. And behind that barbed wire is a notorious British prison where thousands of people were incarcerated and tortured during the time of the Troubles by the British. This is the peace line that mural is painted on. And the people of this working class neighborhood were so proud to educate my wife and I about why Frederick Douglass is important to them. And they actually stopped traffic on West Falls Road so we could take this photograph and others. West Falls Road is like these busy streets out here. It was really incredible. But I close with that example because I want us again to think about the international character of U.S. history, and that we need to be giving credit to people in countries like Ireland, Northern Ireland, Mexico, Haiti, and others for probably knowing more about this country's history than even many of our historians know. So anyway, thank you for being a very patient audience. I'll be happy to take questions.
I think we're just getting a microphone now, but if you have a question, please raise your hand and we will come and find you.
Thank you so much. Do you think, and how do you think this could get on WBAI and KUNM Albuquerque, all the progressive radio stations, so that people could be driving their cars and, going to whatever and hearing it? Because sometimes people don't have time to take off from these jobs and stuff to come and hear this stuff.
Right.
So that's what I'd like to know. And also, will the book be here after today?
I think it will. I would love to. I could even leave this copy if you want me to. I have other copies at home. But actually, I was going to mention I didn't put this out earlier, but I just, Howard Jordan, a lot of you know, listen to Howard Jordan's program. So I'm actually going to be in Howard's program Friday at 4, which is what station? WBI, yeah. So we'll be talking during that time slot about some of these themes. And I really the question is very important because that audio book, that's how a lot of people are learning these stories. And they're picking up nuances from that. I mean, the reading, you know, is amazing. And so it has been getting a lot of radio airplay. There's also the publisher, we're working now on a teacher's edition or a teacher's guide for the book that's geared towards 11th and 12th graders and kind of entry-level ethnic studies courses at colleges, because the idea is to get the word out there. You may be familiar with the fact that Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's Her Indigenous Peoples History of the U.S. is the 3rd volume in the Revisioning American History series. And Roxanne's book has just been translated into Spanish. And so the hope is we're going to do that for this and then also create a children's version as well. So it's all about trying to get the word out there. And the last thing I'll say about this is Beacon Press is one of the world's great radical presses. They were founded by anti-slavery activists. You know, they published the Pentagon Papers. You know, love the Post, that movie, right? Remember the Post? Never mentioned Beacon. Beacon, they were the ones that took the risks. You know, the Post just published excerpts. Beacon Press published the whole thing of the Pentagon Papers, and they published Baldwin when James Baldwin wasn't cool, right? He's cool now, but they published him back in the day. So Beacon is really keyed into that.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mr. Santini. Forgive my accent, a twisted accent. I feel up all your history is wonderful, but I have one question, a particular question. I don't see the name Emilio Zapata. You talk about Mexico, you talk about all Latin America, but I didn't hear about Emilio Zapata.
Yeah. So and the question is, you know, where is Zapata in the story? He's in there, but I have more of a focus on the Mexican War of Independence than I do on the Revolution. Professor Heatherton is working on the Revolution. I have less on the 1960s and more on the 1860s. So Beacon Press, and this is my excuse, it's inexcusable, right? But Beacon Press said you have 300 pages to write this from 1770 to present. And so there was a lot of movements and individuals that I couldn't lift up the way I wanted to. Obviously, he would be one of those. I do talk about how during the Great Boycott, and it's in the introduction, a lot of people don't remember, but during the Great Boycott, when farm workers would go out on strike, their kids would often get expelled from their schools because the growers had so much power they could go to the school district and just kick out all of the kids so they couldn't, you know, matriculate or graduate. And so the UFW had set up an alternative school. And in that curriculum, they taught, they focused on a number of different themes. One of them was learning the history of Emiliano Zapata and the Revolution and connecting that to Malcolm X, connecting that to other themes in Mexican history and African American history. But they have it in their curriculum, and it's important for us to remember. And I love the question. Thank you.
Hello. I like that you used Latinx in the title instead of like Latino, and I was just curious like how that plays into the book and the analysis of it, if it informed it.
Well, and it's my students. You know, I've always been terrible at titles. I haven't picked the title for any of my books, or even probably in my essays. And you know, we had a lot of long conversations, and my students were saying, you know, if you want to reach people in their 20s or younger, let's talk about the gender binary. Let's talk about the gender nature, not just of the Spanish language, but let's talk about the fact that the U.S. is a misogynist nation. It is a misogynist nation, right? Exactly. Thank you, thank you. And so the title was something that was really that's an example of me learning, really, for my students. Now the X, though, after Latino, Latinx, or Chicanx, that itself has a really amazing history. How many hours do we have? Not being facetious, but in the 60s we tried, and this is before my time in the movement, we tried to different iterations of identities. And one of the exciting things is how quickly identities change. I talk a little bit about terms we use to describe ourselves, which have changed radically even in my lifetime. When I started using the word Latino as a university professor in California, some of my mentors like Carlos Munoz were like, what is this? Why aren't you using Chicano? What is this Latino thing? Is it imperialist or something? You didn't like the term, right? But no, again, not trying to be facetious, but I'm just trying to, because in the 60s, just one tidbit, we tried out the term Chicanx for a while. In fact, Howard Jordan remembers that term. And we've talked about this. But the term wasn't, it was also part of an attempt to address gendered language and discrimination, but it was also a sense that we're not part of the original, framing of the nation. We're not, we've had to fight to belong here. And so the X was something that the Chicano movement borrowed from the African American struggle. Yeah.
Hi. I teach high school in the city, and I teach black and brown students, and I've always been really curious and fascinated with the dynamic and the tension between the groups. And part of the reason I was curious about coming tonight was it's really interesting hearing the history of the groups and sort of how they're intertwined, and sort of I'm wondering your thoughts about how these groups have been manipulated to see each other as into an adversarial relationship, and sort of how that services capitalism.
This is, you get to the core of why I wrote this book the way that I wrote it. I didn't start out even teaching this way. When I started teaching at the college level, I actually started teaching more as an organizer with the UFW, teaching about the labor movement, realizing the connected struggles, but also the tensions between different groups, because that's what capitalism is. That's what Cedric Robinson taught us in terms of racial capitalism. Capitalism thrives by creating divisions among people, and it really can't exist. If everyone's united, capitalism just kind of collapses, right? Then we could talk about what happens next, but again, we don't have 2 or 3 hours tonight, right? But no, I was raised with the understanding that among the group that we eventually call Latinos, there was incredible tensions and really severe animosities. And again, I'll talk in the Howard Jordan on Friday about this. Chicago, the Puerto Rican communities against the Mexican communities. Those are bitter conflicts and struggles and battles. And part of the book was to try to emphasize the fact that we have been encouraged to be at each other's throats. We have been encouraged to fight each other over over the crumbs. Howard Jordan was the co-founder of a group, check this out, Latinos Against Apartheid, in the mid-'80s. That's how I met Howard Jordan, was in the archives, and I found this group. And they showed up one day at this big anti-apartheid rally at Washington Square. And they said, we are Latinos Against Apartheid. And the other organizers were like, what? You're what? You're doing what? We thought you were just concerned about your own issues. And they were like, no, we're involved in the struggle against apartheid because one of the oppressive aspects of apartheid in South Africa is the state forbidding people to speak their own languages and forcing them to learn Afrikaans. And as Spanish-speaking people in this country, we know all too well about being forced to not speak Spanish. And so that was one of the things that brought them into that, forming that group. So there are so many examples of solidarities that in some cases our parents, our grandparents, great-grandparents built, but we're never encouraged to remember those. We're encouraged to think about the conflicts. Like when I was in grad school, that's all we talked about was, and part of there's a part of ethnic studies, which I love ethnic studies, but there's a part of it which unfortunately inherited the old immigration history model of, the Irish conflicting with, the Lithuanians or the Jewish. You saw everyone seeing the gangs of New York, right? There's an academic dimension to that of teaching conflict. And so when you talk about African Americans, Latinos, the assumption is, well, they just fit into that pattern of conflict. But the alliances have been really extraordinary. But again, we don't often remember this. So those were very much a part of the book, yeah.
I think we have time for one more.
Thank you. First of all, great talk. That was awesome. Do you talk about any other Caribbean activists, particularly Marcus Garvey, and his impact on Pan-Africanism and Garveyism? And how did that? And if so, did that impact the Latinx experience as well, or?
Yeah, if you look at the handout, so Chapter 5 is Waging War on the Government of American Banks. And a big chunk of that Chapter 5 is really talking about the Universal Negro Improvement Association as an internationalist organization, that has these incredible, foreign language. I mean, if you read The Negro World, which was the publication of UNIA, it's not uncommon to have a French section, a German language section, a Dutch language section. It's really incredible. And then to read, to me as a movement historian, to read these, the thing that I find the funnest reading The Negro World, frankly, is the chapter reports from these small towns in northern Kansas or eastern Cuba, and learning that Havana had about, seemingly like 25 different UNIA chapters. And they're all writing, and it ends up in this publication based in New York City. Isn't that incredible? And they're creating this sense of international struggle so that one of the sequences in this book is to talk about, just take a day out of the Negro World. It has an article about cotton prices in Egypt being manipulated by British capital, British imperialism, and they connect that to sharecropping in the United States and the Great Migration. And so they're connecting labor oppression in Egypt with labor struggles in the United States. And that's what you can do when you have an internationalist vision and when you're from a nation like Jamaica or Trinidad, and you have people like C.L.R. James later, right? George Padmore, Sylvia Wynter, I mean, the list goes on and on. People who are from seemingly small places who can't take these things like nationalism for granted. Like I was recently in Trinidad, and what people say very often is, we've had to learn how to deal with the United States, the Europeans, being in Latin America, and there's an amazing wisdom in being a small nation, and that allows people from small nations to do certain things that people from big nations just take for granted. One of them is international solidarity. But yeah, the Negro World is an amazing resource, and if you're a teacher, I encourage you, now a lot of it's online. Have your students read it. It is incredible to read Amy Garvey write a piece about women in the Haitian Revolution. Wow, it's really remarkable. But yeah.
One more. I'm going to take the last two, and maybe you can
Okay,
take
yeah.
it,
I'll try to be more concise.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your presence. I know this might be difficult, but if there was one seminal event that you've highlighted in your book to help us better understand our interculturality, our connected histories between African Americans and Latin Americans, what would it be?
Oh my gosh. I was going to try to be concise. Well, I think.
Paul, could you take two and then you ask?
Sure, yeah, I'll take as many, you know, as, yeah. I think, again, Reconstruction, and I wanted to maybe flash back to that slide because, and I promise to be concise in this, because on the one hand, we're taught to see Reconstruction as a black-white kind of binary event of African Americans struggling to prove, or I mean, they've already earned their citizenship in the middle of the Civil War, but now they're trying to get it to really stick, right? But in the middle of this titanic struggle, I mean, these are communities in southern Louisiana that are fighting, I mean, physical battles with the Klan, but are also not forgetting their brothers and sisters in Latin America. And I didn't know this stuff. I mean, I thought I knew Reconstruction, but going back and really reading closely about it, I realized, wow, this is what an amazing moment of coalition, of solidarity building. The people who are in this frame, Henry Highland Garnett, as far as I can tell, spoke a lot of Spanish. 66 Bowery was the headquarters of the Cuban Anti-Slavery Society. I want to take a photograph of it before I leave. He was a cabin boy after his parents' freedom from slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was a cabin boy in Havana. You know, in the 1830s, he saw slavery in Cuba. And he gets up and he gives this incredible speech in 1871, or actually it's 1872. At this speech he gives, promoting the work of the Cuban Anti-Slavery Society, the Spanish government has agents, and they're leafleting and flyering. And they're saying, don't trust these crazy leaders, Negro people. The Spanish love their Negro slaves, right? Does that sound familiar? And Garnett just kind of smiles. He just smiles. He had this incredible presence. This is a person who created his own ammunition to fight off a white mob that came to burn down his school when he was about 18 or 19. And so Reconstruction, to me, is that kind of case study. And it's such a revelation. I still get just goosebumps thinking about it.
What obstacles you may face regarding getting your book incorporated as curriculum for the
Yeah.
Global Studies Department, university-wide, throughout academia?
So what obstacles do we face in not just this, but, yeah. Keep building the People's Forum. These progressive spaces. I've been on a national book tour now for about a year and a half. And, yeah. And, but these places, I mentioned the Civic Media Center in Gainesville, Florida. It's not nearly as magnificent as the People's Forum, but it's still our space. It's our space. It's not controlled by a university or a corporation. It's where we have our events. And so I would just say keep organizing. That's the most important thing. And as parents and students, and I talked to the Barnard students today, when you all graduate, don't give up. Now you're alumnus or alumni, and you have a lot of impact. You could have a lot of impact in your institutions. Number one, they're asking you for money. The day you graduate, you're going to get that letter. Now you're a proud alumni, But parents have the right. We as parents have the right to go to our school districts and demand that our histories are incorporated in our children's schools. And again, this is where the energy for this kind of history comes from. Right now, it's really more so at the high school level among parents, students, and teachers than even the college level. So we're making some inroads, but there will always be resistance.
So keep organizing, keep coming, keep building the People's Forum. On that note, please join me in thanking Dr. Paul Ortiz.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.